"The name tag pinned to my blazer," said Margaret, and I suppose that was close enough to the truth. My middle name, the one my mother gave me after her own mother, the one I'd never used in 63 years of living until that Thursday evening in November when I clipped it to the lapel of a navy jacket I'd borrowed from my neighbor Carol and walked through the service entrance of the Persetti Place Sen, Harrington Grand Ballroom as a volunteer registration assistant for the Mercy General Hospital Foundation Gala. I want to be clear about something before I go any further. I am not a dramatic woman. I spent 31 years as an elementary school principal in Dayton, Ohio. I raised 2 daughters largely on my own during the years my husband was doing his residency and then his fellowship, and then building the kind of cardiology practice that gets written up in local magazines. I have sat across from grieving parents and furious school board members and children who had done terrible things and needed someone to look them in the eye without flinching. Drama is for people who have never had to manage a cafeteria fight between 40 second graders. I am practical, I am measured, and I had spent the better part of 4 months telling myself I was imagining things. The late nights I could explain. My husband had always worked late. That was the deal we made when we were 26, and newly married and full of the particular stubbornness that young people in love mistake for clarity. He would build his career, I would build mine. And somewhere in the middle of all that building, we would also build a life together. For 37 years, that arrangement had worked well enough, not perfectly, nothing is perfect, but well enough that I had stopped examining it too closely, which I now understand was its own kind of mistake. The phone calls were what finally cracked the surface of my willful blindness, not that I snooped. I want to be clear about that too. I am not the kind of woman who goes through her husband's phone. Or I wasn't, until the evening in September when his cell rang while he was in the shower, and I picked it up simply to see if it was the hospital, because it always was the hospital, and I saw a name I didn't recognize with a small pink heart emoji beside it, and below the name, a message preview that read, "Thinking about last weekend, can't stop." I set the phone back on the nightstand exactly where I'd found it. I went to the kitchen. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea. And then I sat at the kitchen table in the house where I had lived for 24 years, and I thought very carefully about what a woman my age, with my temperament, with my particular history, does with a thing like that. What she does not do, I decided, is confront her husband of 37 years on the basis of one text message she was never meant to see. What she does is watch. What she does is pay attention. What she does is give the man she has shared her life with the benefit of a doubt he may or may not deserve. And she does this not out of weakness, but out of the same precision that made her a good principal. You do not act on incomplete information. You gather evidence. You understand the full picture before you make any decisions that cannot be undone. So I watched. And what I saw over the following 2 months was not enough to be certain, and more than enough to be afraid. He started going to the gym on Sunday mornings. My husband, who had not voluntarily exercised since his 50th birthday, suddenly had opinions about spin classes and protein shakes. He bought new shirts. He smiled at his phone in a way that reminded me, with a hollow ache I could not name, of the way he used to smile at me when we were dating, that private inward smile of a person who is holding something precious. He mentioned a colleague at the hospital named Diane several times in passing. Diane had suggested a new treatment protocol. Diane had reorganized the scheduling system. Diane was really shaking things up in hospital administration. He mentioned her casually, the way you mention something you have already decided is not worth hiding. It was my younger daughter who, without meaning to, gave me the final piece. She called on a Sunday afternoon in October, wanting to talk about Thanksgiving plans, and somewhere in the conversation she mentioned that she'd run into her father at Millie's Bistro the previous weekend. He was with some woman from the hospital, she said, with the particular carefully neutral tone of a person choosing their words. I waved and he looked kind of startled to see me. She seemed nice, I guess. Pretty. A pause. "Are you guys doing okay, Mom?" I told her we were fine. I told her I was just tired from a long week. I hung up the phone and I sat with what I knew, which was still not quite everything, but was certainly enough. The gala had been on the calendar for months. Mercy General's annual fundraising dinner. Black tie, $500 a plate. The kind of event my husband attended every year, and I usually attended with him. This year, in late September, He'd mentioned almost too casually that the hospital had decided to give spouses and partners the evening off, some new policy about keeping the focus on donor relationships rather than making it a social occasion. I had nodded and said that sounded fine. I had not pointed out that I had attended this exact event as his wife for 11 consecutive years, and that in all that time I had never once been an impediment to donor relationships. The volunteer opportunity came through Carol, my neighbor, who sat on the hospital foundation board. She mentioned it over coffee in early November, that they were still looking for registration table volunteers for the gala. I said I might be interested. I did not tell her why. Carol, to her enormous credit, simply wrote down the coordinator's email address and said the shifts were 4 to 9 p.m. and they'd provide dinner for volunteers during the break. I emailed that same afternoon under my middle name, Margaret Hayes. Hayes is my maiden name. My married name is on every hospital record, every donor list, every place my husband might have thought to look. I had 3 reasons for doing it this way, rather than simply confronting him. First, I genuinely did not yet know, not completely. I had suspicions and a text message preview and a second-hand account from my daughter, which is not the same as knowing. Second, I had watched enough of my friends go through the particular devastation of confronting a husband who then denied everything, who gaslit them into questioning their own sanity, who bought himself months more of deception simply by looking wounded and offended. I was 63 years old. I did not have the patience or the stomach for that version of events. Third, and I think most honestly, I needed to see it for myself, not for evidence in some legal sense. For myself. Because 37 years is a very long time, and I owed it to those 37 years to be absolutely certain before I burned them down. The hair was the first thing. Mine is silver now, quite distinctly silver, and I wear it in a way that people who know me would recognize immediately. I borrowed a dark brown wig from Carol. She'd worn it to a costume party 2 years ago and spent 45 minutes in front of my bathroom mirror until it looked natural enough. Reading glasses with clear lenses from the drugstore. The navy blazer. Black slacks Carol didn't recognize as mine because they weren't. I'd bought them 3 weeks ago specifically for this. By the time I was finished, I looked, I thought, like a perfectly unremarkable woman in her early 60s who you might see working a registration table and promptly forget. The ballroom at the Harrington was familiar to me, and not. I had been there as a guest, as a wife, in evening gowns with my husband's hand at the small of my back. The service entrance was different, narrower, brighter, smelling of warming trays and industrial floor cleaner. The volunteer coordinator, a young woman named Priya who was approximately 26 and radiating the controlled energy of someone managing 17 things simultaneously, handed me a lanyard and a seating chart and pointed me toward the registration table near the main entrance. For the first hour, I was simply working. That helped. I checked in guests, handed out table cards, directed people to the coat check and the bar. I was good at it in the same way I was good at most organizational tasks. I am detail-oriented and I remain calm and I smile without it looking like an effort. Several people thanked me warmly. One elderly cardiologist whose name I had heard my husband mention for years looked directly at me and did not recognize me at all, which told me the disguise was sufficient and also made me feel, briefly, like a ghost at my own life. My husband arrived at 6:47. I know the time because I had been watching the door with the peripheral attention of someone pretending not to watch the door, and I happened to glance at the clock on the wall behind me at the exact moment he walked in. He was wearing the new charcoal suit, the one he'd bought in October, the one he'd shown me with more enthusiasm than he'd shown about clothing in probably 15 years. He looked good. He has always been a handsome man. That is not something I am willing to pretend otherwise about simply because of what came after. He was laughing at something as he came through the door, that easy social laugh he has developed over decades of hospital fundraisers and medical conferences, and he was not alone. She was younger than I had imagined. Not absurdly, she was perhaps 45, 47, with dark hair pulled back and a green dress that was elegant without being flashy. She was carrying a small clutch, and she was laughing too, at whatever he'd said, and the laugh was genuine. I can tell the difference between a genuine laugh and a performed one. I spent 31 years watching children pretend. Her laugh was real, and it landed in my chest like something cold. They approached the registration table. I looked down at the seating chart. I made a small notation on the checklist in front of me that meant nothing. I breathed exactly the way I had learned to breathe during the worst school board meetings, slow and from the diaphragm, the kind of breath that keeps your voice level and your hands from shaking. Dr. and Mrs., the young volunteer beside me, began. "Just Dr. Hartwell tonight," my husband said pleasantly. "And Dr. Bowman." A small smile. "We're at table 7, I believe." Dr. Bowman. Diane Bowman. So she was a doctor too, not just an administrator. I noted this with the detached precision of someone filing information away for later, the way you set a hot pan down carefully and step back and wait for it to cool before you decide what to do with it. I handed him the table card. He took it without looking at me. Why would he look at me? I was a volunteer. I was Margaret. I was no one he had any reason to look at twice. "Thank you," Diane Bowman said to me, and she met my eyes briefly with the pleasant, slightly distracted expression of someone being polite to service staff. She had kind eyes. I noticed that. I did not know what to do with it. I watched them cross the ballroom. I watched him put his hand on the small of her back, exactly where his hand used to rest on mine. I looked back down at my seating chart and I held myself completely still for approximately 30 seconds. Then I helped the next guest in line find their table card and I smiled and I directed them toward the bar and I did not fall apart. The dinner portion of the evening began at 7:30. Volunteers were released for a break at 7:45. Priya had organized a meal for us in a small room off the kitchen, sandwiches and salad, and the particular slightly flat sparkling water that comes in bulk catering packages. I sat with 2 other volunteers, a retired nurse named Barbara and a college student named Jonah, and I ate half a sandwich and answered their questions about what I did for work and whether I'd done foundation events before, and I was so thoroughly, professionally normal that I almost convinced myself I was fine. I was not fine. I was holding a great deal of things very carefully. The way you carry an overfull glass of water across a room, all your attention on not spilling, on each step, on the distance to the table, and the trick of it is that you cannot think about the water directly, because then your hands start to shake. At 8:15 we were back at our posts. The dinner program had begun speeches, award presentations, the kind of formal proceedings that require guests to sit still and look attentive for exactly as long as their patience allows. Priya asked me to circulate through the ballroom with printed program inserts that had been updated at the last minute. I took the stack. I moved through the room quietly. I had not planned to go near table 7. But the room had a particular layout, long and rectangular with the speaker's podium at the far end, and reaching the tables on the left side of the room required passing through the center aisle. I kept my eyes on the table numbers. I was efficient. I was unremarkable. I was 3 tables away when I heard Diane Bowman laugh, low and private, and then my husband's voice very close to her ear saying something I couldn't catch, and then her hand, briefly, covering his on the tablecloth. I delivered the program inserts to table 6. I moved to table 7. I set the inserts down in the center of the table and began distributing them without looking directly at either of them. I was aware of them the way you are aware of a fire in a room peripherally, constantly, in your skin. I was almost clear of the table when the woman to my husband's left, a development officer I'd met at previous galas whose name I could not for the life of me recall, raised her champagne glass toward the couple. "I keep meaning to say," she announced, with the slightly wine-loosened warmth of someone who had been celebrating since the cocktail hour, "that I am just so thrilled for you both, truly, after everything." She beamed at them. "You deserve every happiness." I stopped distributing inserts. I did not mean to stop. My body simply made a decision without consulting me. "Thank you, Patricia," Diane said warmly. "That really means a lot." "And the news," Patricia continued, dropping her voice in the conspiratorial way of someone sharing a secret that is not actually a secret, glancing around the table. "I heard through the absolute worst grapevine, forgive me, but is it true? Because if it is, I am simply over the moon for you." A pause. My husband's expression shifted into something careful and pleased. "We weren't going to say anything officially until January," Diane said. Her hand went to her abdomen, briefly, instinctively, the gesture so small and so unmistakable that I felt the room tilt very slightly to one side. "But yes, we're expecting 15 weeks." Patricia made a sound of pure delight. Several other people at the table offered congratulations. Someone said wonderful, and someone else said the best news, and I stood in the center aisle of the Harrington Grand Ballroom holding a stack of program inserts, and I looked at my husband's face. He was smiling. That private, inward smile, the one I remembered. I have thought often, in the months since, about what I felt in that precise moment. People expect the answer to be rage, or devastation, or some cinematic combination of both. What I actually felt was a peculiar stillness, like the moment after a very loud noise when the air has not yet settled, as if my mind had simply gone quiet because there was finally nothing left to wonder about. I knew everything now. All the incomplete information had resolved itself into a single, complete, undeniable picture. 15 weeks. He had looked me in the eye approximately 4 months ago, on a Sunday morning over coffee, and told me he was worried about his cholesterol. I went back to the registration table. I set down the remaining program inserts. I stood quietly for approximately 2 minutes. And then something happened inside me that I can only describe as a door opening, behind which I found not grief and not fury, but something very calm and very clear and very much my own. I had been a school principal for 31 years. I had stood in front of rooms full of people and delivered information they did not want to hear, and I had done it without cruelty and without theater, and with exactly as much directness as the situation required. I had never once walked away from a hard conversation because I was afraid of what it cost me. I was not about to start at 63. I walked to the speaker's podium. There was no one at it. The evening's program had paused between presentations, the hospital CEO having just returned to his table, and the next segment not yet begun. The microphone was live. I knew it was live because the little red indicator light was on, the same kind I'd watched at 100 school assemblies. I stepped up to the podium and I adjusted the microphone to my height, and I waited for the nearest tables to notice and fall quiet, which took about 10 seconds, and then I spoke. "I apologize for the interruption," I said. My voice was steady. I had always had good projection. "My name is not Margaret. My name is Dorothy Hartwell. I am the wife of Dr. Richard Hartwell, who is sitting at table 7, and I have been working as a volunteer tonight because I needed to understand something that I think I now understand quite completely." The room had gone the particular kind of silent that large rooms go when something unexpected and irreversible is happening. I did not look at table 7. Not yet. I want to say first that I am not here to make a scene. I am 63 years old and I find scenes exhausting and unproductive. I am here simply because I believe that the truth, when it exists, deserves to be acknowledged. And the truth, as best I can determine it, is that my husband of 37 years is expecting a child with someone who is not me, a fact that he has not felt it necessary to share with me in any direct way, which is the kind of omission that ends a marriage. I paused. The room remained silent in the way that rooms are silent when 500 people are collectively not breathing. I also want to say to the foundation staff and to Priya, who ran a beautifully organized event this evening, that I am sorry for the disruption and that the volunteers tonight were absolutely excellent and deserve recognition. A brief pause. Except for me. Obviously, I had an ulterior motive. There was a single, startled laugh from somewhere in the back of the room. Someone's involuntary response to the absurdity of the moment. I understood it. In another life, I might have laughed too. "Richard," I said. I looked at table 7. My husband had the expression of a man who has just discovered that the floor he has been standing on confidently for a very long time is not, in fact, solid. His face had gone a particular grayish color that I recognized from medical discussions about blood pressure. Beside him, Diane Bowman was very still, her hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. "I'm not angry at you," I said. And I found, to my own mild surprise, that this was true. Not because he hadn't earned anger he had, comprehensively, but because the anger was there, and accounted for, and would make itself known in its own time, privately, in the way that real things do. Right now I was simply standing in the truth of it, which required no performance. I'm not angry. I'm just done. I think you know what that means, and I think some part of you, the part that didn't want to have an actual conversation with me, was counting on me never getting to this moment. So I wanted you to see that I got here, that I'm here, that I know. I stepped back from the podium. I replaced the microphone to its original position. I walked back across the ballroom, and I will tell you that the sound of my own footsteps on that floor was one of the clearest things I have ever heard, purposeful and unhurried and entirely my own. I collected my coat from the volunteer area. I retrieved my regular glasses from my bag, the ones I actually needed for driving, and I traded them for the clear-lensed props. I unpinned the name tag that said Margaret, and I dropped it in the small waste bin beside the registration table. Priya appeared at my elbow, her expression somewhere between stunned and professionally concerned. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said quietly. Is there anything?" "I'm quite all right," I told her. "I genuinely am, and the gala is beautiful." "Dr. Castellano's speech about the pediatric wing was wonderful. Please tell him I said so." I squeezed her arm once, lightly. "You're very good at this, you know. You have a gift for logistics." She stared at me. I didn't blame her. The November air outside the Harrington was cold and clean, in the way that late autumn air in Ohio is cold and clean, honestly, without ceremony. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and let it be cold and let myself be in it and breathed. I drove home. Not fast, not slow. I took the route I always took, past the park where I used to take my daughters when they were small, past the coffee shop where I met Carol for breakfast on Fridays, past the elementary school where I'd worked for nearly 2 decades before moving to the principal's position across town. My life, laid out along 17 miles of familiar road, 37 years of it. In the driveway, I sat in the car for a while. The house looked the same as it always did at night, the porch light on, the living room curtains drawn. The same house it had been that morning when I left it to drive to Carol's to pick up the wig and the jacket I'd borrowed and the version of myself I was going to need for the evening. It looked entirely ordinary and also completely different, the way places look when you know something about them that you didn't know before. I called my older daughter from the driveway. It was late, but she is a night person, and she answered on the second ring, and I told her, as plainly and clearly as I could, what I had discovered and what I had done. She was quiet for a long moment when I finished. "Mom," she said finally, "I know. Are you okay?" I thought about that. I thought about what okay meant and what it would mean in the days ahead, the lawyers and the paperwork and the conversations with my daughters and the unraveling of a life so thoroughly built with another person that separating it was going to require a kind of precision and patience I would have to find somewhere inside myself. I thought about the house and the retirement accounts and the small routines, his coffee cup, the particular way he loaded the dishwasher wrong and always had, the Sunday crossword that would have to be unmade, one by one. "Not entirely," I said. "Not yet, but I'm going to be." And I meant it. That's the thing about 63. You know yourself well enough by then to know the difference between the things that will break you and the things that will simply cost you something. And this, as devastating as it was, as much as it was going to hurt in the months ahead, was the second kind. I had survived harder things than the truth. I had survived not knowing, which is actually harder than knowing, because not knowing keeps you suspended indefinitely, and the truth at least gives you solid ground under your feet. Terrible ground sometimes, but ground. I went inside. I made chamomile tea, the same thing I'd made that night in September when I'd picked up the phone and seen the text, because some habits are simply habits, and there is comfort in that. I took off the brown wig and set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a moment, this strange prop from an evening that had already begun to feel both completely surreal and the most real thing that had happened to me in years. I took it back to Carol's the next morning. She opened the door in her bathrobe and looked at me and then at the wig and then back at me, and I told her everything over 2 cups of very strong coffee at her kitchen table. She listened in the focused, generous way that women who have been your friends for 20 years listen, without interrupting, and without the particular kind of commentary that is really just helplessness dressed up as opinion. When I finished, she refilled both our cups and said, "What do you need?" That was the question. What I needed was a very good lawyer, which Carol happened to know, because Carol knows everyone useful in this city and has for the better part of 40 years. What I needed was time, and honesty with my daughters, and the willingness to feel all of it rather than pressing it down into the same careful quiet where I'd stored 4 months of suspicion. What I needed, I was starting to understand, was exactly what I had given myself the night before the truth, without softening, without negotiating with my own certainty, without waiting for someone else to hand it to me. What I did not need was my husband's explanations or his remorse or whatever version of the story he would construct, because I had been a principal long enough to know that the version a person gives after being caught is not the same as the truth of what they did, and I was no longer interested in the distance between those two things. I had been Margaret for an evening and Dorothy for 63 years, and I knew, sitting in Carol's kitchen with cold November light coming through the window and the wig sitting on the table between us like a small deflated symbol of everything impermanent, exactly who I was and exactly what I was walking toward. Hard things, true things, and on the other side of them, eventually, my own life, rebuilt on my own terms, smaller maybe, or differently shaped, but entirely mine. I drank my coffee. Outside, the neighborhood went about its morning, a dog walker, a school bus, the ordinary imperishable world doing its ordinary imperishable things. And I thought, I am 63 years old, I am the hero of my own story, and I am only just beginning.